The woman they were about to throw out had done more for the city than almost anyone in the ballroom knew. And within the next hour, the people judging her would wish they had stayed silent. Evelyn Parker stepped through the entrance of the charity gala carrying herself with quiet confidence. Her dark blue coat was elegant but simple, and compared to the designer gowns and custom tuxedos surrounding her, she immediately stood out. Conversation slowed. Eyes followed her. Some guests glanced at her briefly before returning to their drinks, but others continued staring. Near the registration table, Victoria Sinclair noticed her almost instantly. As chairwoman of the gala committee, Victoria prided herself on knowing every major donor, executive, and public figure attending the event. She looked Evelyn up and down once and frowned. "Please make sure she is supposed to be here," she quietly told a staff member. The employee nodded and moved toward the registration desk. Several nearby guests overheard the comment. Within seconds, curiosity began spreading through the room. Evelyn seemed unaware of it. She calmly accepted a program booklet and stepped farther into the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across polished floors. A large display near the stage showcased photographs from community projects funded throughout the city. Evelyn paused in front of the display and studied the images carefully. Behind her, whispers continued growing. "Do you know who she is?" one guest asked. Another shook his head. Victoria approached with a practiced smile that looked friendly from a distance, but carried an unmistakable edge up close. "Good evening," she said. "Which organization are you representing tonight?" Evelyn turned toward her. "I am just here to support the cause." The answer seemed to frustrate Victoria immediately. "Of course," she replied. "But who invited you?" Several guests nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Evelyn remained calm. "I received an invitation." Victoria waited for more. None came. An awkward silence followed. The staff member returned and whispered something into Victoria's ear. Victoria's expression tightened. Whatever she had expected to hear, she had not heard it. She looked back at Evelyn. "We are having trouble locating your information." A few heads turned. More people began watching openly now. Social pressure filled the room like a rising tide. Evelyn simply nodded. "I am sure it will be sorted out." Her calm response somehow made the situation more uncomfortable. Victoria folded her arms. Most people would have looked nervous by now. Evelyn looked completely at ease. Then something unexpected happened. Evelyn glanced toward one of the large photographs hanging beside the stage. "They finally restored the original playground design," she said softly. Victoria blinked. "Excuse me." Evelyn pointed toward the image. The first version included a wheelchair-accessible pathway along the eastern side. It was removed during early planning but added back before construction. A volunteer standing nearby looked surprised. "How do you know that?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I remember the discussion." The volunteer stared at her. That detail had never been publicized. Victoria noticed the reaction immediately. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. But only for a moment. Then she straightened her posture and looked toward a security officer position near the entrance. Around them, conversations continued fading as more guests sensed something unusual unfolding. And somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, a motorcade had just arrived carrying a man whose next decision would change everything. The security officer did not move immediately, but the fact that Victoria Sinclair had looked toward him was enough. Several guests noticed. The message traveled through the ballroom without a single word being spoken. The woman in the navy coat was no longer simply being questioned. She was being evaluated, judged, quietly pushed toward the edge of an event where everyone else appeared to belong. Victoria stepped closer to Evelyn Parker and lowered her voice just enough to sound polite. "I would like to resolve this before the mayor arrives." The statement carried a subtle warning beneath it. Evelyn met her gaze calmly. "I would like that too." Victoria waited for further explanation. None came. The answer only increased her frustration. Around them, conversations continued fading. A businessman near the stage pretended to study a silent auction display while listening carefully. Two volunteers exchanged confused looks. The young volunteer who had reacted to Evelyn's comment about the playground project could not stop staring. That detail continued bothering him. The accessible pathway had been part of an early planning discussion years ago. Very few people knew it had ever existed. Yet Evelyn had spoken about it as if she had personally witnessed the conversation. Victoria seemed determined to ignore that question. Perhaps there was an error with the invitation, she suggested. These events can become complicated. Evelyn nodded. They certainly can. Another incomplete answer. Another calm response. Victoria felt herself losing control of the interaction. Normally people rushed to defend themselves. They explained. They justified their presence. Evelyn did neither. Instead, she slowly turned toward another photograph displayed along the wall. This image showed volunteers standing beside the ribbon-cutting ceremony for a renovated community center. A faint smile touched her face. They replaced the original windows. A volunteer, standing nearby, blinked. How would you know that? Evelyn looked at the photograph. Because the first contractor installed the wrong design. The volunteer stared. That was never mentioned publicly. Several people heard him. Another ripple moved through the crowd. Victoria immediately stepped in. You seem to know a great deal about these projects. Evelyn looked toward her. I know enough. The answer generated more questions than it answered. The social pressure continued building. Guests who had originally dismissed Evelyn now seemed uncertain. Some still sided with Victoria. Others were beginning to wonder whether something larger was happening. The uncertainty itself created tension. Then another shift occurred. A senior volunteer hurried across the ballroom, carrying a clipboard. He stopped near Victoria and quietly whispered something into her ear. Her expression changed. Not relief. Not confirmation. Confusion. What do you mean there is no donor profile? She asked. Several nearby guests overheard the question. The volunteer lowered his voice further, but the damage was done. No donor profile. The phrase spread instantly through the room. Victoria looked toward Evelyn again. Now even she seemed unsure of what she was seeing. A woman with unusual knowledge of city projects. No visible donor record. No clear organizational affiliation. Yet somehow completely unafraid. Evelyn simply folded her hands and waited. Across the ballroom, the large entrance doors suddenly opened. A wave of movement swept through the crowd as guests turned toward the arrival. Staff members straightened. Cameras lifted. Conversations stopped. The mayor had arrived. And before anyone realized it, the direction of the entire evening was about to change. Mayor Thomas Whitaker entered the ballroom surrounded by donors, city officials, and event sponsors. Yet the energy in the room shifted before he even reached the center of the floor. Conversations paused. Cameras followed him. Guests straightened their posture. Victoria Sinclair immediately moved forward to greet him, eager to regain control of an evening that felt increasingly uncertain. Mayor Whitaker, welcome, she said with a polished smile. The mayor returned the greeting warmly, but his attention seemed divided. His eyes moved across the ballroom as if searching for something. Victoria noticed it. So did several guests nearby. Everything is ready for the presentation, she assured him. The mayor nodded absent-mindedly. Wonderful. Yet he continued scanning the room. Across the ballroom, Evelyn Parker remained standing near the display of community project photographs. She appeared completely unaffected by the mayor's arrival. She quietly studied another image while volunteers and guests continued stealing glances in her direction. The contrast could not have been greater. Nearly everyone in the room was focused on the mayor. The mayor appeared focused on finding someone else. Victoria attempted to guide him toward the stage area. The board members are waiting to meet you. Before she could take another step, the mayor stopped walking. His gaze had landed on Evelyn. A subtle change crossed his face. Surprise. Then recognition. Then something even more unexpected. Genuine happiness. Several guests noticed immediately. Victoria followed his line of sight. Her stomach tightened. The mayor was looking directly at Evelyn Parker. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then the mayor began walking. Not toward the stage. Not toward the board members. Not toward the city executives waiting near the front. He walked directly toward Evelyn. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Guests stepped aside automatically. Conversations disappeared completely. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Victoria stood frozen as the mayor passed her without another word. The security officer near the entrance lowered his radio. Several volunteers exchanged bewildered looks. The young volunteer who had questioned Evelyn earlier stared in disbelief. Every step the mayor took seemed to increase the tension. People began looking from Evelyn to the mayor and back again. Nobody understood what was happening. Evelyn finally looked up from the photograph. Her expression remained calm. There was no surprise in her eyes. If anything, she looked as though she had expected this moment all along. The mayor's smile widened as he approached. 20 feet away, then 15, then 10. Guests moved farther aside to clear a path. Victoria felt every confident assumption she had made earlier beginning to crack. A donor standing beside her whispered, "Does he know her?" Nobody answered. 5 feet away now, the mayor slowed. The ballroom had become so quiet that the faint music from the speakers sounded distant. Every eye in the room was fixed on the same scene. Evelyn and the mayor stood facing one another beneath the golden light of the chandeliers. Then Mayor Thomas Whitaker extended his hand and spoke words that instantly changed the atmosphere of the entire gala. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "I was beginning to wonder if you were ever going to tell people who you are." Evelyn Parker looked at the mayor's outstretched hand and smiled. "I was hoping to enjoy one event without that conversation." A few guests laughed nervously, unsure whether they were witnessing a private joke or something much bigger. Mayor Thomas Whitaker shook her hand warmly. "That has never worked before, and I doubt it will work tonight." The exchange sounded familiar, comfortable, the kind of conversation shared between people who had known each other for years. Around them, confusion deepened. Victoria Sinclair stood motionless several yards away. She had spent the entire evening trying to determine whether Evelyn belonged in the ballroom. The mayor's behavior suggested a very different question. How important was Evelyn Parker really? The mayor turned slightly toward the crowd. "I am glad you made it." Evelyn nodded. "I almost stayed home." That answer produced another ripple of surprise. Nobody spoke to the mayor that casually, yet he seemed amused rather than offended. "Then I am very grateful you changed your mind," he replied. The young volunteer who had questioned Evelyn earlier exchanged a stunned look with another staff member. Nearby donors were now openly staring. Even the security officer appeared uncertain what to do with himself. Victoria finally stepped forward. "Mayor Whitaker," she said carefully, "you know Ms. Parker?" The mayor looked toward her. For a moment, genuine surprise crossed his face. "Know her," he repeated. Then he glanced back at Evelyn. "I assumed everyone here knew her." Complete silence followed. Victoria felt the color leave her face. Several guests looked from the mayor to Evelyn and back again. The statement landed harder than any public announcement could have. The mayor continued, "Without Evelyn, half the projects being celebrated tonight would never have happened." A murmur spread through the ballroom. The photographs lining the walls suddenly seemed different. Guests who had spent the evening admiring the exhibits were now looking at the woman standing beside them. Victoria struggled to process what she was hearing. "I do not understand." The mayor studied her expression. Then he looked around the room. It became obvious that many people shared the same confusion. "You mean nobody explained?" he asked. No one answered. Because no one could. There was no donor profile, no corporate sponsorship banner, no giant foundation logo attached to Evelyn's name. She had arrived alone and dressed simply. Nothing about her appearance hinted at influence. The mayor smiled faintly. "That sounds exactly like Evelyn." Several guests laughed softly, though the tension remained. The mayor stepped toward one of the large project displays and pointed toward a photograph of a newly renovated youth center. "This building exists because of her." He pointed toward another image. "So does that playground." Then another. "And that scholarship program." Every new statement increased the disbelief spreading through the room. Victoria felt her certainty collapsing piece by piece. She remembered every assumption she had made since Evelyn entered the ballroom. Every judgment, every whispered instruction, every glance toward security. Meanwhile, Evelyn seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. "Thomas," she said quietly, "that is enough." The mayor smiled. "Not even close." The crowd leaned closer. Cameras lowered. Drinks remained untouched. Nobody wanted to miss the next words. Because for the first time all evening, everyone understood that the woman they had nearly removed from the gala was connected to the very reason the gala existed. And the full truth had still not been revealed. The ballroom remained silent long after the mayor finished speaking. Guests who had spent the evening admiring photographs and reading descriptions beneath the exhibits now found themselves staring at the woman standing quietly beside them. Evelyn Parker looked almost uncomfortable beneath the attention. It was the opposite reaction most people expected from someone connected to so many major projects. Victoria Sinclair noticed that immediately. The more she learned about Evelyn, the less she understood her. Most influential people arrived with entourages. They wanted recognition. They wanted introductions. Evelyn had arrived alone, said almost nothing, and seemed ready to disappear into the crowd. Yet according to the mayor, entire community programs existed because of her. The contradiction fascinated everyone. Mayor Thomas Whitaker glanced around the room and seemed to recognize the confusion. I can see from your faces that many of you have questions. A few nervous laughs followed. The mayor smiled. That is understandable. He walked toward one of the large displays featuring photographs from scholarship recipients across the city. 5 years ago, a private donor approached our office with a proposal. The room became even quieter. Guests leaned closer. Cameras lowered. Nobody wanted to miss a word. The donor did not want public recognition. The mayor continued. No naming rights. No press conferences. No public announcements. Only one condition. He paused. The money had to reach the people who needed it most. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Victoria felt a strange knot forming in her stomach. Somehow she already knew where the story was going. The mayor turned toward Evelyn. Every year since then, that donor expanded the program. He pointed toward another display showing renovated community centers. Then came the youth centers. Another photograph. Then the playgrounds. Another. Then emergency housing support. Each sentence transformed the atmosphere further. What had started as curiosity was becoming admiration. Yet Evelyn still said nothing. She simply listened. A donor standing near the stage finally spoke. You are saying she funded all of this? The mayor smiled. Not alone. He looked toward Evelyn. She would never allow me to phrase it that way. Several people laughed softly. Evelyn shook her head with a faint smile. Because it would not be true. The mayor nodded. Exactly. He looked back at the crowd. She built teams. She brought organizations together. She connected people who cared about the city. Her greatest contribution was not writing checks. It was helping others work together. The distinction landed powerfully. Even Victoria could feel it. This was not the story of a wealthy benefactor seeking praise. It was the story of someone who had spent years creating opportunities for others while remaining almost completely invisible. The young volunteers suddenly remembered Evelyn's comments about the playground and the community center. They made perfect sense. Now, she had known those details because she had been there from the beginning. Across the ballroom, guests began looking at the project displays differently. Every photograph now carried an unseen connection to the woman standing among them. Victoria lowered her eyes. She remembered questioning Evelyn's invitation, questioning her presence, looking toward security. The memory felt increasingly painful. Then another shift occurred. A senior member of the Gala board approached the mayor carrying a folder. He quietly handed over a document. The mayor opened it, glanced at the contents, and laughed softly. Well, he said, looking toward Evelyn. This explains why your name was not appearing anywhere tonight. Evelyn immediately recognized the folder. And for the first time all evening, genuine concern crossed her face. Mayor Thomas Whitaker held the folder for a moment longer, still smiling as though he had stumbled across something both amusing and entirely predictable. Around him, guests waited in silence. Every conversation in the ballroom had stopped. The photographs, the auction displays, even the musicians near the stage seemed forgotten. All attention was focused on Evelyn Parker. For the first time that evening, however, she looked slightly uncomfortable. Thomas, she said quietly, please do not. The mayor raised an eyebrow. You know exactly why I have to. A few guests exchanged curious glances. Victoria Sinclair watched closely. Earlier, she had been certain Evelyn was an uninvited guest. Now she felt as though she knew almost nothing about the woman standing in front of her. The mayor opened the folder and glanced at the first page. Then he looked toward the crowd. This explains why nobody could find her donor profile. The room became even quieter. Several board members leaned closer. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. The mayor lifted the document slightly. Because every donation connected to her was intentionally filed under a different structure. A ripple moved through the audience. Confusion mixed with anticipation. The mayor continued. For years, she requested that her name never appear on public donor lists. Several guests stared at Evelyn in disbelief. A businessman near the stage shook his head slowly. Who does that? He whispered. No one answered. The mayor smiled faintly. Someone who never wanted credit. He looked back at the document. The committee respected her wishes. Then he paused. Until tonight. A few nervous laughs followed. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, as though she already knew what was coming next. The mayor turned another page. Many of you know the Parker Community Initiative. Heads nodded throughout the ballroom. The program was one of the most respected charitable partnerships in the region. Thousands of families had benefited from it over the years. Scholarships, youth centers, housing support, educational grants. Most people assumed the initiative had been created by a large corporate foundation. The mayor looked around the room. Evelyn Parker founded it. Silence. Complete silence. Victoria felt the air leave her lungs. Several guests stared openly. Others looked toward the project displays lining the walls. Suddenly, every photograph carried a different meaning. The businessman near the stage lowered his glass. The young volunteer who had questioned Evelyn earlier looked completely stunned. The mayor continued. Not only did she create it, she spent years refusing public recognition. He smiled toward Evelyn, which made honoring her almost impossible. A soft wave of laughter moved through the room. This time it carried admiration rather than confusion. Yet the revelation was not finished. The mayor closed the folder and stepped closer to Evelyn. There is one more reason I wanted everyone to know who she is. He looked toward the crowd. The city council approved a resolution this morning. Guests leaned forward again. Victoria could barely look away. The mayor's expression softened. Next month, the new Family Resource Center will officially carry Evelyn Parker's name. Gasps spread throughout the ballroom. Several guests immediately began applauding. Others joined. Then more. Within seconds, applause filled the room. Yet while everyone else celebrated, Evelyn looked genuinely overwhelmed. Not proud, not triumphant. Overwhelmed. She lowered her eyes for a moment as the applause continued around her. And standing only a few feet away, Victoria finally understood that the woman she had nearly removed from the gala was not simply one of the most important people in the room. She was the reason many of them had been invited there in the first place. The applause continued longer than anyone expected. Guests who had spent the evening discussing donations, sponsorships, and community impact were now applauding the woman who had quietly helped shape so much of it. Yet the person receiving the recognition seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. Evelyn Parker offered a small smile and gently shook her head as though the celebration belonged to someone else. That reaction only increased the admiration spreading through the ballroom. Most people would have embraced the moment. Evelyn seemed eager to escape it. Mayor Thomas Whitaker eventually raised a hand, and the applause gradually faded. The room grew quiet once again. This time the silence felt different. Earlier it had been filled with judgment and uncertainty. Now it carried respect. The mayor looked toward Evelyn. You see why keeping secrets becomes difficult? A few guests laughed softly. Evelyn smiled. I warned you years ago that this would happen eventually. The mayor nodded. You did. Their familiarity continued surprising people. Victoria Sinclair watched every exchange. The more she learned, the worse she felt. Earlier, she had looked toward security. She had questioned Evelyn's invitation. She had assumed she did not belong. Meanwhile, Evelyn had spent years helping the very causes being celebrated tonight. The contrast became impossible to ignore. Nearby guests were beginning to realize it too. A donor who had remained skeptical throughout the evening stepped forward first. Ms. Parker, he said, extending his hand. It is an honor to meet you. Evelyn shook his hand politely. Then another guest approached. Then another. Within minutes, people who had ignored her when she arrived were waiting for the opportunity to speak with her. The transformation was remarkable. Yet Evelyn treated every person exactly the same way she had before the reveal. Calm, respectful, unpretentious. The young volunteer who had questioned her knowledge of the community projects finally gathered enough courage to approach. I owe you an apology, he said. Evelyn looked genuinely surprised. For what? The volunteer smiled awkwardly. I thought you were making those details up. A few people nearby laughed. Evelyn laughed too. That is fair. The volunteer relaxed immediately. The simple exchange revealed something important. Evelyn never seemed interested in making people feel guilty. She did not collect apologies. She accepted them and moved on. Across the ballroom, Victoria stood alone for a moment. She watched guests gather around Evelyn. She watched the mayor speak with her. She watched volunteers smile at her. And she remembered every assumption she had made within minutes of seeing her enter the room. The memory felt heavier with each passing second. A member of the gala board approached Victoria quietly. You could not have known. Victoria looked at him. That is exactly the problem. The board member frowned. Victoria glanced toward Evelyn. I decided who she was before I knew anything about her. The honesty surprised even herself. Nearby, The mayor was now sharing stories about early community projects. Several guests listened attentively. Every story revealed another example of Evelyn stepping away from recognition so others could receive credit. Every story reinforced the same lesson. Character had built her reputation long before titles ever could. Victoria listened from a distance. Slowly, she began walking toward Evelyn. Guests stepped aside as she approached. Some recognized the significance of the moment immediately. The woman who had tried to remove Evelyn from the gala was finally coming face to face with the consequences of her own judgment. And for the first time all evening, Victoria Sinclair had no prepared speech, no polished explanation, and no authority to hide behind. Only the truth. Victoria Sinclair stopped a few feet from Evelyn Parker and suddenly found herself unable to speak. Just hours earlier, she had been confident, composed, and completely certain of her judgment. Now every word she had planned seemed inadequate. Around them, conversations softened. Guests noticed the moment immediately. The tension was different now. There was no hostility left in the room, only anticipation. Evelyn looked toward Victoria with the same calm expression she had worn since entering the ballroom. No anger, no satisfaction, no desire to embarrass her. Somehow that made the situation even harder. Victoria took a breath. "Evelyn," she said quietly. The use of her first name alone felt like a small acknowledgement of how much had changed. Evelyn smiled politely. "Yes." Victoria lowered her eyes briefly before looking back up. "I owe you a much larger apology than the one I have been rehearsing in my head." A few guests nearby exchanged glances. Nobody interrupted. Evelyn listened patiently. Victoria continued. "When you arrived tonight, I made assumptions about you almost immediately." Her voice remained steady, but the regret behind it was obvious. "I decided where you belonged before I knew anything about who you were." The ballroom grew even quieter. Some guests looked uncomfortable because they remembered having similar thoughts. Victoria glanced toward the entrance where she had first seen Evelyn. "I questioned your invitation. I questioned your presence. I even considered asking security to escort you out." Several people lowered their eyes. Hearing the words spoken aloud carried more weight than hearing them whispered earlier. Victoria shook her head slowly. "The truth is, none of those decisions were based on facts." She paused. "They were based on appearances." The honesty landed deeply. Evelyn remained silent for a moment. Then she smiled gently. "Thank you for saying that." Victoria blinked. That was all. No lecture. No criticism. No reminder of how wrong she had been. Just gratitude for the honesty. The simplicity caught her off guard. "You are being very generous." Evelyn laughed softly. "Not really." Victoria looked confused. Evelyn glanced around the ballroom. "Everyone makes assumptions sometimes." Several guests nodded almost instinctively. The statement felt uncomfortably true. Evelyn continued. "What matters is what we do when we realize we were wrong." The words settled over the room. They were not directed only at Victoria. Everyone knew that. They were directed at every person who had judged her before learning the truth. The mayor smiled quietly from nearby. He had heard Evelyn say similar things for years. A donor standing near the stage shook his head with admiration. "That may be the most gracious response I have ever heard." Soft laughter moved through the crowd. The tension finally began to dissolve. Victoria smiled for the first time all evening. A genuine smile. Not the polished expression she used at public events. Something real. "I appreciate that more than you know." Evelyn nodded. "Then we are even." The answer immediately changed the atmosphere. People relaxed. Conversations slowly resumed. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Guests who had arrived expecting an ordinary charity gala had witnessed something far more memorable. They had seen influence hidden beneath simplicity. They had seen dignity withstand public judgment. Most importantly, they had seen kindness defeat embarrassment without ever seeking revenge. As the evening continued, people no longer gathered around Evelyn because of her status. They gathered because of the example she had set. And throughout the ballroom, one realization continued spreading from person to person. The most remarkable thing about Evelyn Parker was never the money she donated, the projects she funded, or the recognition she avoided. It was the character she displayed when nobody believed she mattered. The remainder of the evening unfolded in a way nobody could have predicted when Evelyn Parker first walked through the ballroom doors. The whispers had disappeared. The judgment was gone. In its place was something much rarer. Reflection. Guests continued moving between displays, auction tables, and community exhibits. But the conversations had changed. People were no longer discussing appearances, titles, or social status. They were discussing character. Again and again, the same realization surfaced. The woman many had dismissed within seconds of seeing her had spent years improving lives throughout the city without asking for recognition. Mayor Thomas Whitaker remained at the gala longer than originally planned. Several times throughout the evening, he was asked to speak about community initiatives, and each time he found a way to redirect attention toward the volunteers, teachers, nonprofit leaders, and families whose efforts had made the project successful. Evelyn smiled every time he did. It was exactly why they had worked so well together for so many years. Neither cared much about applause. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sinclair watched guests interact with Evelyn. What struck her most was not the admiration. It was the consistency. Evelyn treated the mayor exactly as she treated the volunteers. She spoke to donors the same way she spoke to staff members. There was no performance, no shift in personality depending on who stood in front of her. For perhaps the first time in her life, Victoria realized how much energy people spent trying to appear important. Evelyn never seemed interested in appearing important at all. Near the end of the gala, the organizers invited guests to gather for closing remarks. The room gradually settled into silence. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across the ballroom as attendees took their seats. Mayor Whitaker stood near the stage and offered a brief speech about community service, generosity, and responsibility. Then he paused and looked toward Evelyn. Several people expected him to invite her onto the stage. Instead, he simply smiled. Some of the most important people in our city are the ones who never ask to be noticed. The ballroom became quiet. No names were mentioned. None were necessary. Everyone understood. A few moments later, the event concluded. Guests slowly began collecting coats and saying their goodbyes. Many stopped to thank Evelyn personally. Some apologized for assumptions they had made. Others simply shook her hand. She accepted every conversation with the same grace she had shown all evening. As the crowd thinned, Victoria approached one final time. "I think this evening taught me more than any leadership conference ever could," she admitted. Evelyn laughed softly. "That sounds expensive." Victoria laughed too. It was the first completely relaxed moment they had shared. "You know what I mean." Evelyn nodded. "I do." The two women stood quietly for a moment, watching volunteers dismantle displays and clear tables. The photographs along the walls remained illuminated beneath the ballroom lights. Images of playgrounds, youth centers, scholarship recipients, and families stretched across the room like a visual history of lives changed through kindness. Finally, Evelyn picked up her coat and prepared to leave. There was no dramatic exit, no entourage waiting outside, no celebration. She simply thanked the staff and headed toward the door. Several volunteers smiled as she passed. One nodded with quiet respect. Evelyn returned the gesture and continued walking. And as the ballroom lights gradually dimmed behind her, the lesson of the evening remained. Titles can impress people. Wealth can attract attention. Recognition can fill a room. But character reveals itself long before any of those things are known. And that night, an entire ballroom remembered what true dignity looks like.